You think I owe you respect just because you're old? Officer Dean Mercer shouted through the rain, the barrel of his gun pressed to the head of the black man standing tall, unblinking. You just pointed a gun at a justice of the United States Supreme Court. The entire street fell silent. For a moment, the power shifted. The one holding the gun trembled, while the one in handcuffs held the fate of the entire system. The video spread like wildfire, igniting outrage across America. Who gave them the right to humiliate a soul just because of the color of his skin? When justice is violated, it rises, and this time it wears the face of an old man who once passed judgment on the entire nation. What state are you in? If you saw that happen right where you live, would you stay silent or dare to face the truth? Raindrops fell one by one onto the silvery gray pavement, stretching into blurred streaks of water that reflected the flickering red lights of the vintage car parked by the curb. Lincoln Avenue was quiet, filled only with the sound of wind threading through the trees and the steady hum of a few passing cars. Inside the old black car, Isaiah Cole, silver-haired and calm-faced, leaned down to pick up a sheet of paper the wind had blown from his briefcase. It was just a short note, nothing important, but quietly picked it up as if in a chaotic world, simply finishing one small act was enough to bring peace of mind. He opened the door and stepped out, his shoes making a soft splash as they met the water. No one could have guessed that such a simple gesture would mark the beginning of a chain of events that would shake all of America. A patrol car came speeding in, braking hard, its tires sending water spraying. The door flew open, and Officer Dean Mercer stepped out with the air of someone ready to find fault in anyone. He was young, face tight, his eyes showing the fatigue and irritation of someone used to power and the fear it brought. Mercer glanced at the vintage car, then at the silver-haired man bent over to pick up the paper as if the act itself were a crime. "What are you doing here?" he asked, his voice cold and flat in the rain. "Didn't see the no parking sign." The question wasn't meant to inquire, but sounded more like an accusation already formed in his mind. Isaiah looked up, a drop of rain rolling down his cheek, and answered calmly, "I'm just picking up something that belongs to me." Mercer snorted, his eyes half mocking, half challenging. "The way you'll sound, like you think you're above the law." The words came out with a thin, arrogant smile. The old man didn't respond right away. His gaze dropped to the shiny badge on the officer's chest, that small piece of metal catching the flash of red lights like a warped mirror of justice. "I respect the law," Isaiah said slowly, his voice low and full, cutting through the rain more like advice than defiance. "I just hope those who carry it do the same." Mercer frowned, the short smile at the corner of his lips disappearing, replaced by a scowl tinged with irritation. In his world, people who said things like that were the kind who needed to be taught a lesson. Turner, Mercer's partner, stayed in the car, watching quietly, his eyes flickering with hesitation. He didn't know who the man was, but there was something different in his gaze. Not fear, but something like pity for the person standing in front of him. Mercer stepped closer, his voice lowering. "You're obstructing traffic. I have the right to ask for your ID." Isaiah calmly reached for his wallet, pulled out his driver's license and registration, his movements slow, showing no sign of worry. "You can check," he said. "Everything's in order." Mercer glanced over the documents, then back at the man, a growing frustration rising in him for reasons he couldn't explain. Something in the way Isaiah stood in those steady eyes that didn't flinch made him feel diminished. "This guy thinks he's some kind of noble," Mercer muttered. "Too good to respect an officer of the law." He folded the papers sharply and handed them back, his voice curt. "I'm going to run the plates. Maybe your registration's expired." Isaiah remained calm. "Do what you believe is right." That calmness felt like fuel on fire. Mercer clenched his fists. The rain was falling harder now, covering two people standing on opposite ends of power and holding a gun the other carrying only composure. In that moment, thunder rumbled in the distance, a warning sound of something about to break. Turner opened the door, intending to step out, but stopped when Mercer turned and shot him a warning look. Isaiah looked at the young officer and exhaled gently, not out of fear, but like someone who had seen too much to still be troubled by something as fragile as authority. He glanced at the rainwater carrying the sheet of paper from earlier, now vanished into the drain. In that flickering light, he saw reflected the image of a country once built on the promise of justice, now shaken by hands that had forgotten what it meant to serve. Mercer raised his radio, gave a brief report about a suspicious individual, his voice cold and indifferent as if the old man were nothing more than another number in a daily log. Isaiah stayed silent, eyes drifting toward the end of the avenue, where the dim lights of the city still glowed even under the darkened sky. He knew this wouldn't be the end. The way Mercer looked at him, the way he spoke every word, carried the familiar stench of contempt Isaiah had seen in far too many cases. But this time he wasn't the one passing judgment. He was the one being judged on the street in the rain by someone who had never realized he was standing on the thin line between being a man and becoming something else. The last gust of wind swept through rain, striking his face. Isaiah slowly closed his eyes, letting the icy drops touch skin, already weathered by too many storms. Beneath the steady roar of rainfall, he spoke a single sentence that made Turner shiver. Justice, if it still exists, is soaking wet in this rain. Mercer didn't understand what he meant, but he would soon, because in just a few more minutes the storm would no longer belong to the sky, but to the life that was waiting to come for him. The heavy rain lashed the pavement, each drop shattering on the hood of the police car. Red and blue lights flashed non-stop, their glow spreading across puddles like blood seeping through cold wind. The air was thick, the silence suffocating, broken only by the radio, buried beneath the sound of rain. Mercer took a deep breath, face flushed, eyes sharp with irritation. He drew his gun, the motion swift and deliberate, as if trying to cut through the distance between himself and the unsettling calm of the man before him. "Hands up, that's an order," he barked, voice hoarse and hard, slicing through the wind. Turner stood nearby, startled, his eyes shifting from his partner to the silver-haired man who hadn't moved an inch. Isaiah Cole lifted his face, rain streaming down his cheeks, catching the flash of the lights. He spoke in a low voice, each word slow, but enough to make Mercer feel challenged. "You are abusing your authority, officer. I've broken no law." Mercer sneered, a twisted smile blurring the line between anger and arrogance. He stepped closer, boots slapping against water. Turner muttered, "Dean, stop it. He's just an old man." Mercer didn't look back, only growled, "He's about to learn his place." The rain poured harder, casting a murky veil over the tense scene. Mercer stepped in the cold barrel of his gun, pressing against Isaiah's forehead. "I am the law here, you understand." His voice sliced through the downpour like a blade. The old man stood straight, his frame slight, carrying a presence that made Turner question who really held the power. Isaiah stared directly into the barrel, his eyes still as a lake in a storm. He spoke softly, but the words cut through Mercer's rising rage. "If you are the law, then today the law is afraid." In that instant, everything froze. Mercer's hand twitched, his eyes flickered. Then he gripped the gun tighter, needing to prove he wasn't shaken. "For an old man, you've still got a sharp mouth," he growled. "Let's see how long you keep that calm," Isaiah said. Nothing, only stared back. His gaze wasn't defiant, wasn't pleading, but the look of someone who had seen too much, who had judged men far greater than Mercer many times before. What Mercer saw wasn't fear, but a quiet contempt that made his blood boil. Turner stepped back, his hand trembling slightly, not from cold, but from fear that something was slipping out of control. "Dean, you're going too far," he said, voice shaken. Mercer didn't hear. He shouted louder than the storm, "Stand still. He needs to learn obedience." His voice echoed down the avenue, bounced off the brick walls, returning like a warning. Isaiah closed his eyes for a moment, drew a long breath, then opened them again. His voice was the same quiet, sharp as steel. The obedience you want isn't respect, it's fear. And fear, officer, never lasts long. Those words stopped Mercer cold. He felt as if the man had seen straight through him into the place where arrogance was used to cover a rotten fear. The rain poured harder, soaking his face, but he didn't wipe it away. His hand still held the gun high. "You think a few wise words will make me lower my weapon?" Mercer said, his voice full of contempt. "I've dealt with hundreds like you thinking a few gray hairs give them the right to disrespect the law." Isaiah tilted his head slightly, his lips curving half a smile, half pity. "The problem is, you've never understood what the law really is." Turner watched the scene, his heart pounding. Everything was moving too fast. He felt caught between two worlds, one holding a gun and rage, the other holding truth and resolve. Rain slapped his face, and he suddenly understood this wasn't a clash between officer and civilian, but between power and conscience. He stepped forward, but Mercer raised his hand to stop him, eyes flashing with the danger of a man losing control. Isaiah still didn't move, didn't step back. His voice dropped nearly a warning. "You'll regret this moment, Mercer. Not because you're pointing a gun at me, but because you're pointing it at the soul of your profession." Mercer opened his mouth to say something, but thunder cracked above and swallowed the words. The wind whipped at his raincoat, the headlights glinting off the polished barrel. Turner held his breath, eyes darting between the two men. In the blurred light of the storm, the old man stood firm, his shadow stretched long across the wet ground. Mercer noticed his hand trembling, but he refused to admit it. "You think I don't have the guts?" he hissed. Isaiah answered as softly as a breath, "I think you do, but that doesn't make you right." The words sent a chill down Turner's spine. Mercer's breathing grew heavy, his eyes lost for a second in a moment of struggle. In the rain, the only sounds left were the wind, ragged breathing, and the fragile space between the gun's muzzle and a single blink. Then Isaiah closed his eyes like a man praying, not for himself, but for someone else's soul. Mercer froze his hand, dropping slightly without knowing why. Turner stepped forward, his voice shaken. Dean put the gun down. Mercer took a long breath, turned away, hiding the turmoil in his eyes. Isaiah remained where he was, his gaze calm, fixed on the fallen rain. In that silvery downpour, there was something that made Turner feel he was witnessing more than just a moment, as if justice had been tested, and it was humanity that had to answer for it. The rain had stopped, leaving only droplets falling from the eaves tapping steadily into the dim midday light. The wet pavement mirrored the figures of three people facing each other, an old man with silver hair, a young officer trembling with anger, and one caught between silence and conscience. A distant siren echoed, blending with the wind into a chilling sound. Mercer still stood there, gun lowered, but fury unrelenting. Isaiah's gaze cut into his pride like a blade, making him feel humiliated in the rain that had just ended. He stepped forward, voice low and heavy with contempt. "Get on your knees, you stubborn old man." Isaiah stood still, shoulders rising slightly with each breath, not from fear, but from cold. His voice was hoarse, yet deep, each word clear. "I only kneel when I pray, not when I'm being degraded." The words were gentle, but their weight pushed Turner back half a step. Mercer clenched his teeth, his face flushed red, his young eyes filled with anger and a deep stinging sense of insult. "Arrogant for someone your age?" he snarled, then stepped in and shoved the man's shoulder. Isaiah staggered slightly, but kept his balance, his eyes steady and unflinching. A heavy silence fell. The wind stirred the trees, shaking loose a few soaked leaves, and in that moment Mercer raised his hand and yanked the handcuffs from his belt, the metal flashing under the red and blue lights. The metallic snap cracked through the air, cold as a verdict. Mercer gripped Isaiah's wrist tightly, clamping the cuffs until blood seeped from the skin. Isaiah shivered faintly, but didn't cry out, didn't resist. Sweat and rain mixed with blood, forming a faint smear on the dark sleeve of his suit. Mercer watched with a twisted smile. "Pray, maybe God will hear you." Isaiah raised his eyes to him, his voice soft like a lament. "If God is listening, he must be crying for this country." The words sent a chill down Turner's spine. His eyes locked on his partner's hand, clamping the cuffs, too afraid to step forward. Across the street, a woman stopped her car and rolled down the window, eyes wide in horror at what she saw. She pulled out her phone, the camera trembling in her hand, capturing the image of the silver-haired man being forced to the sidewalk. Mercer flinched at the flash of the phone's light. He shouted, "Put that phone away. This is police business." But the wind carried his voice away, and more people stopped to watch. They gathered in a small circle, eyes filled with fear and outrage. Isaiah was on his knees, hands pulled behind him, face tilted upward, leftover raindrops trailing down like sweat. He said nothing more, only stared straight at Mercer, and that look made Turner feel as though he was the one on trial. Mercer still didn't stop. He leaned down, growling into the man's ear. "Now, do you see who really has the right to give orders?" Isaiah replied, his voice hoarse. "Power doesn't teach people respect, Mercer. It only makes them forget who they are." Mercer pushed him lower, his voice choked with rage. "You think I'm afraid of your little lectures?" Turner took a deep breath, his lips pressed tightly. In that moment, he understood he was witnessing the line between enforcing the law and degrading a person being erased with a single pull of the arm. The crowd began to stir. A young man's voice rose from somewhere. "Let him go. He didn't do anything." Another shouted, "I got the whole thing on video." Mercer spun around, face flushed red. "Who gave you permission to interfere? This is official business." Raindrops tapped wind, howled, and metal clinked in the heavy air. Isaiah tilted his head, his eyes landing on Turner, the only one still able to stop this. Turner bit his lip but stayed still. The old man's look made him feel more ashamed than any words ever could. Then Isaiah spoke softly, his deep voice carrying, "They say justice is blind, but today you're the one who sees nothing." The words drifted with the wind, reaching every eye watching. Mercer froze for a second, his grip still tight, but his gaze wandered. He didn't know why his chest suddenly tightened, as if something in those words had made him realize what he had lost. Turner looked at him, eyes filled with a mix of disappointment and pity. Rain seemed to return, drops falling on the blood smeared across the pavement, spreading into a pale red stain. A gust of wind swept through, lifting the sheet of paper Isaiah had picked up earlier. It slid past Mercer's feet, then was carried into the gutter at the edge of the road. Isaiah watched it go, his lips moving as if speaking to himself. Some things once dropped can never be picked up again. Mercer didn't understand, but Turner did. He knew the old man wasn't talking about the paper, but about trust something now being washed away with the last of the rain. The scene lasted only minutes, but it was enough to change the fate of all three men. Isaiah knelt in the middle of the street, his eyes strangely calm, while Mercer stood above him, breathing hard, consumed by chaos. Turner lowered his head, the weight inside him growing heavy. The words, the stares, even the drops of water clinging to the road, all of it etched into their memory, warning of another storm coming not from the sky but from the conscience of man. Night fell slowly over the town of Brookhaven, the wind slipping through the rusted iron bars, carrying the damp scent of moss and metal. The small jail cell was lit by a single dim yellow bulb, its scattered light casting shadows on the stained, damp walls. The rain had stopped long ago, but its moisture still hung in the air, clinging to the skin like a cold reminder of the chaos earlier that afternoon. Isaiah Cole sat silently in the center of the room, hands cuffed in front of him, head slightly bowed, his face expressionless. Outside the bars, the steady footsteps of the guard echoed a dull rhythm of stagnation and power. Each step sounded like a slow toll of suspended time. The metal door screeched open, its shrill sound cutting through the silence. Dean Mercer entered, his shadow stretching across the damp floor, the smile on his face caught between satisfaction and leftover anger. The dim light blurred his features, but his eyes still carried that same arrogant glare. He stepped closer, voice hoarse and cold as a blade. "So who's stronger now, old man?" The words were full of gloating, like he'd won a fight only he believed he was in. Isaiah raised his head, his eyes holding a strange calm, the kind that unsettled Mercer more than resistance ever could. "You're strong," Isaiah said slowly, his voice rough but steady, each word falling onto the damp floor like dripping water because I let you think so. Mercer froze, the smile vanishing. He stepped closer, rage swelling inside him, fists clenching tight. "I'll make sure you remember that in here, your skin color means nothing." His voice echoed in the small space, the last word slicing the air like a blade. Isaiah looked up, meeting his stare without flinching, his deep black eyes, reflecting the yellow bulb like a dark lake hiding something old, something far away. "You can cuff my hands," he said softly, voice calm and cold, but not my dignity. The words thickened the air. Mercer stopped his fist, clenched so tightly the veins rose under his skin. The fluorescent light buzzed, flickering like it might go out. Outside, the wind whistled through the bars, rattling the metal with a biting chill. Turner stood in the hallway, hearing every word from inside. He looked through the gap in the door and saw the old man sitting beneath the pale yellow light, small but unyielding. And Mercer, the partner he once thought he understood, was stepping across the line between duty and cruelty. Turner pressed his lips together, his chest tightening as if someone had gripped it in their hand. Mercer stepped closer, his shoes squishing against the wet floor with a sticky, unpleasant sound. He leaned down to Isaiah's level voice, lower but tight with frustration. "You think those words are going to make me feel guilty? I don't need anyone to teach me about dignity." Isaiah tilted his head slightly, his eyes still calm. "No one can teach you that," he said slowly. "Only life can make you understand." Mercer let out a laugh, its echo in the damp, narrow room sounding like clashing metal, cold and hollow. "Life, what's your life worth to teach me anything?" He raised his head high, stepped back, arms spread as if holding all the power. "In here, I decide who's right and who's wrong." Isaiah watched him, no longer angry, no longer judging. He responded slowly but firmly. "You're mistaken, Mercer. In here, you only decide how you treat others, not their worth." Mercer went quiet for a few seconds. He turned his face away, trying to hide the flicker in his eyes. A part of him sensed something was slipping, but he pushed it away, clinging to the pride that had carried him since he first put on the uniform. "You think you're noble," Mercer said bitterly, "but people like you are the reason others hate moral preachers." Isaiah closed his eyes and nodded gently. "Maybe you're right, but hating what's right doesn't make what's wrong justified." Turner clenched his fist, feeling the tension in every breath of the room. Mercer was losing not by force, but by words that made him feel small. It was a feeling Mercer had never known, seeing himself reflected in someone else's eyes. He slammed his hand against the bars, the noise echoing off the walls, then turned and stormed out. Just before leaving, he said, voice shaken between anger and helplessness, "You'll see words don't save anyone." Isaiah looked after him, his voice soft but clear. "Maybe not, but they save the conscience of those who hear them." The iron door closed, leaving behind a silence so heavy it felt like a weight. The sound of the lock clanking shut rang out like a hammer striking the remains of broken trust. Isaiah sat still, eyes lifted toward the flickering bulb overhead. He exhaled a long breath, blending into the cold air the smell of cement and metal, thick as if time itself had turned solid. In the corner of the room, water dripped steadily from the ceiling, drop by drop, like a clock with no hands still counting the long seconds of justice held captive. Outside, Turner still stood there, his hand gripping the handle of his gun, a deep unease growing inside him. He didn't know why, but he felt certain this wouldn't end in that room. He looked at the silent figure of the old man, seeing not submission, but another kind of strength, quiet and fierce, like a storm waiting for its moment to tear through everything. In that damp night, Mercer believed he held the power, but Turner knew the one who truly held it was the man still sitting there, hands in cuffs but a heart that had never bowed. Inside the command room of the Brookhaven station, the air was so thick it could be felt in every breath. On the wall, the clock ticked slowly the second hand, moving forward with a dry, deliberate click. The dim fluorescent light cast a pale glow over faces lowered above desks. The rain had stopped outside, but the sound of water dripping from the tin roof echoed steadily like a countdown to something about to explode. A duty officer held a phone to his ear, his voice slightly trembling. He had just finished a call from Central Command, his hand still stiff as he placed the receiver down. For a moment, every sound in the room seemed to vanish, leaving only the heavy breathing of those standing nearby. "What did Central say?" a deep voice asked from the command desk. The captain's eyes locked on the pale face of his subordinate. The officer swallowed, glanced around, then answered with a tight, shaken voice. "The man we arrested this afternoon is Justice Isaiah Cole." The words hit the room like a blade. Everyone turned, faces draining of color. Turner froze mid-step in the corridor, heart pounding. Mercer, just stepping out from the holding area, his shirt still damp with rain, hands smelling of metal, let out a dry laugh, thinking it was a joke. "Justice who?" he said, the smile fading. "Say that again." The officer held out the facts with trembling hands, voice rising. "Justice Isaiah Cole, United States Supreme Court, confirmed by Washington. He went off the grid a few hours ago on a private assignment." In that instant, the entire room fell into absolute silence. It was as if sound had been sucked from the space, leaving only the heartbeat thudding in each chest. Mercer stood, frozen eyes wide, the pen slipping from his fingers onto the tile floor, with the sound barely audible, yet strangely loud. Turner stared at him, no longer with blame, but with disbelief, because even he couldn't process what he had just heard. One of the 9 most powerful figures in the country, a man whose voice shaped the nation's legal destiny, was sitting locked in a cell beneath their feet. Mercer's mouth fell open, lips dry, his voice trembling. "No way. Who is he really?" The door swung open. Isaiah entered, wrists still marked by deep red cuff lines. He was flanked by 2 senior Justice Department officers who had escorted him from their car. The entire station stood up instinctively. Mercer stepped back, lips parting slightly but unable to form a word. The hallway light poured in behind Isaiah, casting a pale golden outline around him. He stopped in the middle of the room, his calm gaze moving slowly across each face. Not a word was spoken, but the pressure in the air made it hard for anyone to breathe. He looked straight at Mercer, eyes deep and steady, and spoke, voice low but clear. "I warranted you, Mercer, but you thought justice was just a badge." Mercer stood still, his shoulders trembling slightly. His young face had gone pale. Everything that had once been pride was now gone. Isaiah's words from earlier echoed in his head, each one now sounding like proof of his blindness. He stammered, trying to find his voice again. I didn't know." His voice was weak, like a child caught in the biggest mistake of his life. Isaiah looked at him, his gaze neither angry nor resentful, only so deeply sorrowful that it made others lower their eyes. "It's because you didn't know," he said slowly, "that you hurt what this entire nation was built on." Turner stood nearby, his eyes blurred in the dim light. Every word from Isaiah rang out, not with noise or force, but with a quiet clarity that made everyone in the room feel like their conscience was being exposed. The captain exhaled heavily, his face tightening, then he bowed his head. "Justice Cole, we're sorry. This was inexcusable." Isaiah gave a slight nod, his voice calm. "I don't need an apology. I need you to remember that in a country built on law, the most dangerous thing is when those who hold the law forget why they hold it." Mercer bowed his head low, his hands clasped together, fingernails digging into his skin until they bled, yet he didn't dare lift his eyes. Every excuse he had prepared suddenly felt meaningless. Turner looked at him, and for the first time in all his years on the force, he felt pity for his partner, a man trained to give orders but never taught how to listen. Isaiah held out his wrists and a Justice Department officer stepped forward to unlock the cuffs. The sound of metal snapping open rang through the room like a reversed verdict. When his wrists were freed, he looked down at the red welts and gently rubbed them, not out of pain, but out of regret. Regret for a generation that had forgotten the power of law doesn't lie in the hand, but in the heart. He turned to Mercer one last time, his voice lowering. "You'll have to live with this, Mercer, but take it as a lesson. Justice doesn't die at the hands of the mistaken. It only dies when no one dares to admit the mistake." The room was silent. The light flickered, reflecting off the silver-haired man standing among dozens of young officers. He walked slowly, his rain-soaked shoes leaving faint footprints on the polished floor. Each step seemed to erase the distance between real power and false power. When the door closed behind him, a gust of wind slipped through the crack, carrying the cold scent of metal from the cuffs now resting on the desk. Mercer didn't move, his eyes fixed on his empty hands. For the first time in his life, he understood what it felt like to be truly seen by justice and for it to say nothing. Just hours after Isaiah Cole was released from the Brookhaven station, the entire country knew about the incident. It all began with a video less than 2 minutes long recorded on a passerby's phone. The footage was blurred by rain, but clear enough to show a silver-haired man, hands cuffed, kneeling in the middle of a soaked street, while a young officer pointed a gun at his forehead, shouting something unintelligible. The red and blue lights from a patrol car flashed across the water's surface, and at the 13th second, the man looked up and said in a deep, steady voice, "If you are the law, then today the law is afraid." That sentence cut through the wind, icy and sharp, and it changed everything. The video was uploaded to social media just 10 minutes later with the caption, "Brookhaven police point gun at elderly black man in the street." Within an hour, it had spread across the entire state. 10 hours later, it appeared on major news sites. The nation began to erupt. Headlines flashed non-stop: "Police aim gun at innocent elderly black man." "Outrage in Brookhaven when justice kneels in the street." The light from millions of phone screens lit up the faces of people, shocked, angry, and then swept into a fury no one could stop. The comments under every post were filled with cold questions no one dared answer. If he weren't a Supreme Court justice, would he still be alive? How many other innocent people have knelt like that without a camera watching when the law is held by the blind who protects justice? One question followed another, building into a wave that swept through every forum, every evening. News segments spilling into cafe conversations, bus rides, and classrooms. No one talked about the weather, sports, or politics. They talked about Isaiah Cole and about the gun aimed at his head. Major newspapers launched special coverage all at once. "Who's protecting whom?" bold letters stretched across front pages. The still frame from the video, the moment Isaiah stared down the barrel of the gun, became the symbol of an entire movement for police reform. In the image, his eyes showed no fear, only a quiet sadness, as if looking straight into the soul of a country once proud of its freedom. Below it, thousands shared the image with the same caption, "This is not just a man. This is a reminder for all of us." As night fell, the streets of New York, Chicago, Atlanta, and even Washington lit up. People poured into the streets holding signs that read, "Justice for Cole Equality. Before the law, power must kneel." Drums echoed through the crowds, mixed with chants, car horns, and footsteps. What began as spontaneous protests turned into a massive wave. In Brookhaven, where the incident took place, the police station was surrounded by a sea of people holding candles. Turner looked out from the station window and saw thousands of tiny lights flickering like fallen stars. He realized he was living in a moment where truth was no longer trapped behind walls, but had become the voice of millions. At the same time, Mercer sat in his small apartment, lights off, lit only by the glow of his laptop screen on his pale face. The video replayed on every channel again and again like a verdict that needed no courtroom. At the 13th second, he saw himself the angry face, the gun in his hand, and Isaiah's eyes. He clenched his fist, heart racing, breath heavy. He didn't know what he feared more: public backlash, justice, or his own reflection. A message popped up on his phone. Dean, they know. The video reached Washington. He dropped the phone, collapsed into the chair, Isaiah's deep voice echoing in his head. You thought justice was just a bad. On national news channels, special reports on the Brookhaven incident aired non-stop. Commentators spoke about abuse of power, about the fear Black Americans live with, about reforms that never reach the root. Some defended Mercer, saying he was just following protocol, but most were outraged. What protocol allows a gun pointed at an old man's head? What law teaches that power justifies humiliation? Public anger evolved into a rallying cry. Human rights groups, attorneys, law professors, voices that had once stayed silent now began to speak. Then something no one expected happened. In the central square of Washington, a group of law students raised a large white banner, the bold red letters glowing in the night, Justice Cole. From that moment, the hashtag spread everywhere. Within 24 hours, it became the nation's rallying cry, crossing the boundaries of social media and stepping into the real world. People wrote it on walls, printed it on shirts, hung it on doors, stuck it on cars, carved it into handheld signs. Justice Cole was no longer just support for one man, but the voice of millions who had been treated unjustly, forced to bow before power they never owed. Isaiah Cole, once handcuffed in the rain, had become a symbol for an America facing its own reflection. And while the crowds kept marching and the chants still echoed through the night somewhere in a silent room, Mercer sat still in the cold glow of the screen, staring at the face of the man he once humiliated, then whispered, "You made the whole country kneel before its own conscience." Morning in Brookhaven began with a strange kind of silence. The police station, usually filled with the noise of footsteps and ringing phones, was now reduced to the scattered hum of a printer and the heavy breathing of those inside. Outside, the gates, reporters crowded shoulder to shoulder, microphones and cameras aimed squarely at the building. Voices murmured, cameras clicked non-stop, and every so often someone shouted, "Have they said anything about the Cole case yet?" or "Where's Mercer? What does he have to say about pointing a gun at a Supreme Court justice?" The glass doors rattled with each strong gust of wind, reflecting the anxious faces of the officers inside. Those who once wore their badges with pride now kept their heads down, avoiding each other's eyes, as if sharing the same burden of shame. Mercer walked into the conference room, shirt half-buttoned, dark circles under his eyes from a sleepless night. He had been summoned early, and though he knew what was coming, part of him still held a fragile hope that something could be explained. But the moment he stepped in and saw the way his colleagues looked at him, he understood no words would fix this. On the table, a suspension notice lay neatly beside his badge and service weapon. The captain stood at the window, back turned, voice hoarse with exhaustion. "Dean Mercer, you are suspended indefinitely. The Department of Justice will conduct a full investigation." As soon as the words landed, Mercer shot to his feet, the chair slamming into the wall. He shouted, voice hoarse and edged with desperation, "I didn't do anything wrong." He challenged me in public. I followed protocol. A few young officers nearby kept their heads down, silent. Turner, standing in the corner, walked slowly toward him, his voice low and steady. "You weren't provoked, Dean. You chose how to show your power." Mercer spun around, eyes bloodshot. "My way," he snapped. "Do you know how he looked at me, like I was trash blocking the path of justice? He looked down on me." Turner looked back at him, tired but sincere. "You're confusing respect with fear. You want people to fear you because deep down you've never believed you deserved their respect." Mercer shrugged. Turner off his voice, breaking like wind rushing through an open door. "If he were just a regular citizen, no one would care. Don't play righteous with me. We all know if he weren't a Supreme Court justice, no one would be talking about this. How many people have knelt in the street seat and no one said a word. But because it was him, the whole country pretends to be outraged. The room fell silent. Everyone looked at Mercer, not with judgment, but with a quiet sadness. Turner spoke slowly, his voice catching. Justice isn't just for people with titles, Dean. It's for everyone. But you never believed that because you never looked at others as human. Mercer clenched his fists, the veins on his neck standing out. He wanted to argue, to shout, but no words came. What Turner said cracked something inside him, something he had buried for years beneath the uniform. He dropped into the chair, exhaled sharply, his eyes vacant. The captain stepped forward, placed the document on the table, his voice heavy as lead. "You should leave before the press gets in. This is no longer an internal matter." Mercer gave a faint, bitter smile. "I'm a victim of the media," he said softly. "They turned me into a monster while I was just doing my job." Turner answered, voice steady but firm. "No, Dean, you weren't turned into a monster. You did that yourself, day by day, every time you used your badge to cover your fear." Mercer looked up at Turner, his eyes full of resentment and helplessness. "Easy for you to say," he muttered. "You're not the one the whole world turned its back on." Turner sighed, eyes drifting to the window where the crowd was gathering. "The world didn't turn its back on me," he said, "because I never turned my back on myself." Outside the gate, reporters grew louder. They shouted questions, snapped photos, pushed microphones into the faces of anyone who walked out. A few officers quietly cleared off their desks, removed family photos, and tucked their badges into drawers. The atmosphere in the station felt like the eye of a storm, not one outside, but one rising inside each person. Mercer stood, picked up his badge, and stared at it for a long time. The cold metal in his hand made him shiver. He looked at Turner, his voice rough. "You think I deserve to be destroyed?" Turner replied softly. "No one deserves to be destroyed, Dean, but everyone has to pay for the choices they make." Mercer left the paper behind and walked out of the room. Flashbulbs hit his face, blinding and sharp. The barrage of questions, the shouting, the whir of camera shutters, but he said nothing. He moved through the crowd, head down, his wet shirt clinging to his back. The sky over Brookhaven was dark again, clouds thick as if signaling another storm. Turner stood in the doorway watching Mercer disappear into the mass of reporters, then murmured, "This storm isn't coming from the sky, it's coming from within us." And in that chaos, no one could tell whether they were witnessing the fall of one man or the beginning of a new era for justice. Morning in Washington began with the sound of hundreds of reporters crowding outside the White House gates. The heavy iron doors swung open and a line of Justice Department vehicles moved in while national television networks broadcast live every minute. Since the Brookhaven incident, the Capitol had not seen such unrest. Major newspapers called it the ethical earthquake, a scandal that didn't just expose the misconduct of a few individuals, but revealed deep fractures in the public's faith in the entire system. Inside the White Building, at the center of power, the nation's top legal authorities sat across from each other, their faces heavy. No one dared speak first, knowing that even a single misstep could ignite an already furious public. Isaiah Cole entered the Justice Department hearing room in a gray suit, his silver hair catching the soft light from the ceiling fixtures. He didn't come as a victim, but as someone who had once stood at the highest peak of legal authority. His presence cast a hush over the room. When the Attorney General invited him to speak, Isaiah stood, his voice low, steady, and clear. "I don't seek revenge. I want to reset the scale that justice has allowed to warp." The words dropped into the room like stone. No one clapped, no one bowed their head. They just watched him. The man who had once symbolized fairness, now standing to prove justice, still had meaning. Outside, the media streamed the hearing live and millions watched their screens. They saw an elderly man, past 70, standing tall, his voice firm, his eyes lit with belief. There was no anger in his words, only the pain of someone who had once believed the system couldn't break. When he spoke, every word struck like metal hit in stone. The law cannot be built on fear. Anyone who wears a badge must remember that power is not given to push people down, but to lift them up when they fall. A reporter in the front row raised a trembling hand. "Justice Cole, do you forgive the man who did this to you?" The question froze the air. Every camera turned toward him. Isaiah looked at the young reporter and offered a soft, sorrowful smile. "I forgive him," he said, his voice quiet but carrying, "but the law does not." In that moment, the entire room fell silent. Everyone there felt the chill down their spine, not because of a threat, but because of the truth in his word. Forgiveness is a human choice, but accountability is justice's duty. He wasn't asking for revenge. He was demanding awareness. The cameras moved quickly, capturing the image, the elderly man standing in the light, eyes bright, yet burdened with the American flag gently waving behind him in the hum of conditioned air. That same afternoon, the sentence appeared on every front page. "I forgive him." But the law does not became the headline that spread across every platform shared millions of times within hours. The media called it the quote that woke America. Young people pinned it to classroom walls, lawyers wrote it on whiteboards in their offices, and everyday citizens posted it on signs outside their homes. It wasn't just a statement, it was a warning to society that morality is not defined by power, but by action. Meanwhile, in Washington, the outrage continued to grow. The president called an emergency meeting with the attorney general and the director of the FBI. He spoke firmly. "We cannot allow justice to be misunderstood. We need to show the people that the law doesn't only exist on paper." A full-scale investigation was ordered, including a nationwide review of police training protocols. All eyes turned to Brookhaven, where a young officer was now facing the consequences of an action he once believed was routine. Mercer sat alone in his suburban apartment, the TV on playing back Isaiah's speech. He stared at that face, not hateful, but suffocating in its calm. When he heard, "I forgive him, but the law does not," Mercer felt the room shrink around him, and he became a child caught in the greatest mistake of his life. He turned off the TV, but the words still echoed in his mind. Turner called, but he didn't answer. He knew things had gone far beyond his control. Across the country, in front of the Supreme Court, hundreds of people gathered with candles. They didn't shout, didn't protest, they simply stood in silence. Among the flickering lights, someone held up a white sign that read, "Forgiveness is human. Accountability is justice." Isaiah Cole saw the image on television and his eyes softened. In that moment, he knew what he had done was not in vain. A nation is only truly strong when it feels shame for its own mistakes. And in the night, as headlines continued to flood in as America stayed deep in discussion, Isaiah's words were engraved on the gates of the Justice Department, cast in bright bronze. Under the lights, justice doesn't need to be loved, but it must be respected. The outrage had erupted from Washington, but buried within it was an awakening that sometimes one person standing calm in the middle of a storm can make an entire country look into the mirror of its own conscience. That morning, the Federal Investigation Commission building in Washington was heavy with tension. Reporters lined the entrance flash bulbs, firing nonstop, lighting up the bronze plaque that read Federal Ethics and Justice Commission. This was the first hearing since the president signed the order for a full investigation into the Brookhaven incident. Inside the main hearing room, rows of leather chairs were neatly arranged with a thick file in front of each seat containing every statement, image, and piece of evidence tied to the case. Isaiah Cole sat in the front row watching silently, his eyes no longer cold like in the early days, but deeper, as if seeing something far beyond the judgment of one man. Mercer entered, flanked by 2 guards, his frame thin, his face worn. Every lens turned to him, and in that moment the pride that once held him tall in the rain was gone. Turner sat in the witness section, hands tightly clasped, eyes lowered. When the chairperson asked him to speak, Turner rose, his voice rough, echoing slowly in the still room. I stayed silent out of fear, and that silence made me guilty. The room went still. He drew a deep breath and continued. I was afraid of losing my job, afraid of being hated, afraid of being seen as a traitor to my team. But I forgot that justice doesn't need defenders. It only needs someone brave enough to speak. Many bowed their heads. A few reporters stopped writing because in his voice was something more honest than any defense they had ever heard. Isaiah looked at him and his gaze softened, as if someone had finally understood the weight of truth. When it was Mercer's turn, the tension in the room thickened. He stood, shoulders trembling, his eyes unfocused. His voice was low, hoarse, breaking between each word. I believed being a cop meant having the right to judge. Now I know I'm just a man. That bare admission froze the entire room. He paused for a moment, then continued slowly, as if speaking only to himself. I used to think I was protecting the law, but really I was protecting my pride. I confused honor with power, enforcing the law by feeding my ego. That day, I didn't see a man, I saw skin color and the way he looked at me, and it scared me. At that final line, Isaiah gently closed his eyes, and a drop of sweat rolled down Mercer's temple, but it looked like a tear. The chairperson nodded, his voice calm and steady. Justice is not built by perfect people, but by those willing to admit they were wrong. The sound of typing resumed, but this time not to chase headlines. It was to capture a rare moment when truth wasn't distorted by words. Isaiah stood, the light hid in his silver hair, casting across a face worn by years of strain. He didn't speak of guilt or sentencing. He simply looked toward Mercer, his voice quiet, clear. Justice doesn't diminish anyone, it only reveals what we've left hidden in the dark. A wave of silence swept through the chamber. Someone on the commission gave a small nod. Turner bowed his head in tears, and Mercer sat, frozen hands clasped tight. Outside, the midday sun poured through the tall windows, shining directly onto the gold letters on the wall. Truth demands courage. In that moment, everyone understood this investigation wasn't only about punishing wrongdoing, it was about restoring the trust of an entire nation. The prosecutor stood, his voice ringing sharp in the vast room, each word striking like a hammer against the wall of silence. That very trust is what you destroyed when you killed the meaning of the law. The words echoed, and Mercer bowed his head even lower. Sweat fell from his forehead onto the blank witness form, leaving faint stains. In that moment, every eye in the room was fixed on him, not with hatred, but with disappointment. The prosecutor continued, his tone growing colder. The law is not made to feed anyone's ego. It exists to protect those who have no voice. And when someone uses power to crush that badge or title aside, he has chosen the side of wrongdoing. Mercer swallowed hard, hands locked tight, his eyes trembling, searching for something to hold on to. He tried to speak, but his throat clenched shut, and any defense was stuck in his chest. The prosecutor lowered his voice, slower now, as if speaking directly to the system. He stood for, the law doesn't die. In one day it dies slowly through the silence of those who were meant to defend it. And today your fear, your blind belief that you were allowed to act in the name of justice, killed the spirit of the law. The words thickened the air as if the whole room had taken a breath and no one dared release it. Isaiah sat in the front row, the white light casting deep shadows into the creases around his eyes. He listened quietly, his gaze holding no hate, only a vast sorrow. In those eyes was something like pity for the lost, for the system he had once believed in without question. He looked at Mercer now, bowed, and recalled the moment in the rain that same man once stared back at him with pride and fear. Now, in front of true justice, he looked unbearably small. Isaiah exhaled the breath carrying the weight of someone who had once placed his full faith in an ideal he had helped build. No one realized that it was Isaiah's silence that made the room feel even heavier. He didn't say a word, but that gaze of his made people feel like they were being seen through. A few reporters in the back stopped taking notes and camera shutters fell silent. Turner sat quietly behind them, hands clenched, eyes filled with tears. The prosecutor bowed in thanks and took his seat, leaving behind a long stretch of silence. In that silence, Isaiah gently closed his eyes as if speaking only to himself. The law may judge actions, but only conscience can judge a man. The white ceiling light reflected on his fogged glasses, looking like the last glimmer left in a room full of shadows. Mercer looked up, met that gaze, and for the first time understood why people call justice sacred, because it holds no anger, no vengeance, but still makes the guilty feel so small they barely dare to breathe. As the hearing came to a close, Isaiah remained seated back, straight hands folded on the table, eyes fixed on the empty space ahead, not waiting for a verdict, but as if saying farewell to a part of his old belief something time and people had worn thin. In the fading light, his face emerged in the quiet room, gentle, yet heavy like a sentence that needed no words. That afternoon in Washington blazed with sunlight reflecting off the white stone columns in front of the Supreme Court. The plaza was packed with people, crowds arriving from across the states carrying banners, flags, and signs that read, "Respect is the law." No one chanted, no one rioted, only a silent sea of people, eyes fixed on the podium where Isaiah Cole was about to appear. A soft breeze rustled the white ribbons tied along the fence, a symbol of the purity of justice the people had come to reclaim. On the platform, reporters crowded in, cameras pointed directly at the wooden lectern. Turner stood in the security line, eyes following the silver-haired figure walking slowly between two rows of guards. No words were spoken yet. The silence echoed louder than any chant. Isaiah stopped at the center of the stage, resting both hands gently on the podium. The light reflecting off his glasses made his face glow under the scorching sky. He looked out over the plaza at the thousands of waiting faces, then spoke in a warm, steady voice that echoed through the speakers. Justice does not lie in the barrel of a gun, but in the hand that knows when to stop. Applause rippled like waves, spreading from the front rows to the very back. He waited for quiet to return, then continued each word, slow and firm, as if etched into the air. Justice cannot be enforced by fear, but by respect. A nation loses its strength when those who hold the law forget why they were given it. His eyes dropped to the rows below where dozens of officers stood, one of whom had bowed deeply. Among them, the chief of police of Brookhaven stepped forward, his face weary. He walked toward the podium, removed his cap, and bowed his head before the public. Thousands of lenses zoomed in, capturing the moment, the image of a state's top law enforcement official bowing before the symbol of justice. He spoke, his voice catching between rounds of applause. "Judge Cole, people of America, on behalf of the police force, I apologize. We forgot that the badge on our chest is not a shield to protect our pride, but a vow to defend human dignity." The crowd fell silent, and many were moved to tears. Isaiah gave a slight nod, a faint smile passing across his face like a flicker of light at sunset. Above them, the American flag snapped in the wind, red and blue, streaked with the golden light of the setting sun. Isaiah looked up, his voice lowered. "Today we are not just speaking about one incident. We are speaking about the soul of America. Justice is never perfect, but what keeps it alive are those who dare to keep its flame from dying." The entire plaza held its breath. Only the wind and the clicking of cameras could be heard. Turner looked at him, a feeling rising in his chest that he couldn't quite name, part pride, part regret. He understood that some flames do not burn with rage, but shine with the light of compassion. Isaiah stepped back, his gaze settling on the row of people holding candles below. One flickering light joined another, forming a vast sea of brightness in the heart of the Capitol. Without any cue, the crowd collectively raised their candles, the shimmering glow illuminating signs that read, "Justice lives here." The sight made him smile gently, then close his eyes and whisper, "At last, they've heard." Far away, Mercer watched from a dark room, his face lined deeply with regret. The light from the plaza reflected on his face, faint but steady. Though no longer in uniform in that moment, he understood that true justice had never left it, had only been waiting for people to learn how to see their own light. Turner stood among the crowd, his dark coat soaked with sweat and sundust, surrounded by thousands of others, all facing the podium. The chant, "Justice lives," here echoed, blending with the wind sweeping across the square, sounding like the heartbeat of the entire city. He did not chant, nor did he carry a sign. He just stood still, his eyes red. When Isaiah ended his speech and bowed to the crowd, Turner felt his throat tighten, tears rolling down unchecked. In that moment, he realized that what changes people is not orders, but the courage to face their own mistakes. The wind from the Supreme Court blew past, carrying with it the chimes of a nearby church ringing like a quiet absolution. Turner looked up at the deep blue sky, the sun's glare making him squint, and he smiled softly. He knew he hadn't saved Isaiah that day, but he could begin again by becoming someone justice could trust. Within the sea of people, he felt the breath of those around him. Young people carrying hope, elders holding memories, all sharing one belief that justice was still alive. Turner bowed his head, his hands clenched, feeling as if the blood in his veins was warming. He recalled the nights at the station, the half-hearted conversations, the avoiding glances between colleagues, and understood that silence, too, could be a kind of guilt. Now, seeing hundreds of candles raised high, he felt as though he was being forgiven, not by others, but by his own conscience. Hundreds of miles away, in a small suburban apartment, Mercer sat alone in front of the television. The light from the Washington Plaza cast a glow over his face, highlighting the tired features and sunken eyes. His hair was disheveled stubble, unshaven, making him look 10 years older than the day he was suspended. When Isaiah appeared on screen, the man who had once knelt in the street, now standing before thousands, Mercer felt a sharp ache in his chest. He turned the volume up, listening to that steady, warm voice as it traveled through the broadcast. Each word Isaiah spoke felt like a small blade slicing through memory, making every moment of that fateful rainstorm resurface, vivid enough to send a chill down his spine. Mercer's face turned pale, his eyes fixed on the image of the silver-haired man smiling in the middle of the crowd. A sense of guilt rose within him, heavy as stone, forcing him to grip the edge of the chair to keep his balance. He recalled the words Isaiah once said in the holding cell, "You can cuff my hands, but not my dignity." Back then, he took it as a challenge. Now, he understood it was a warning. The screen shifted to a scene of hundreds of flickering candles in the night, a soft tune playing in the background, and Mercer turned off the TV. The room fell into silence, broken only by the quiet ticking of the clock. He sat still for a long time, gaze distant, surrounded by four cold walls. Somewhere out there, justice was being reborn, while he who once wore it on his chest now found himself small and alone in the shadows of redemption. The federal courtroom in Washington was bright under white lights with not a single empty seat. The gallery was packed with reporters, journalists, citizens, and familiar faces from the justice marches for Isaiah Cole. The air was thick, heavy, as if someone had drained all the oxygen from the room. On the jury bench, 12 people sat upright, their expressions stern. Mercer sat at the defendant's table, his face gaunt, eyes sunken, hair disheveled, his black suit neatly pressed but unable to hide the exhaustion in him. In front of him, a large screen lit up, and as the prosecutor nodded, the plaintiff's lawyer played the video of the Brookhaven incident. The first sound was rain. Then Mercer's voice echoed through the room, sharp and cold. "Hands up, that's an order." The image on screen showed Isaiah's face in the rain, calm, with cuffed hands and a gun aimed inches from his forehead. Some in the courtroom looked away. Others clenched their hands. Turner sat on the witness bench, lips pressed tight, eyes wet. When the video ended, the room fell into dead silence. Even breathing sounded too loud in the stillness. The prosecutor stepped forward, his voice firm. This is the moment America must face itself. A police officer failed to see a human being only an authority. The issue isn't race, it's that we've forgotten how to see each other as equals. Mercer bowed his head, both hands clenched, veins raised along his neck. His defense attorney stood struggling to form a plea. The defendant acted in a state of impaired judgment, unaware of the full context. He didn't know the man was a Supreme Court justice, but the words came out weak, out of place under the cold stares around the room. Isaiah sat in the front row, hands clasped, his gaze, absent of anger, filled instead with deep sorrow. When the court allowed Mercer to speak, he stood breathing heavily, his voice trembling. I didn't see him as a person. That sentence made the room hold its breath. A few people in the back leaned forward slightly, and some reporters stopped writing, eyes wide. Mercer continued, his voice cracking. I saw a black man disobeying my order, and in that moment I saw him as a threat. I was trained to act, but not trained to understand. He looked up at Isaiah, eyes full of heavy remorse. I was wrong, and I know an apology won't erase that image from your mind. But if possible, I want you to know that the man standing here today is no longer the one you saw in the rain. Isaiah looked at him for a long time, his eyes seeming to see through everything. Then he gave a slight nod. No words were needed. That small gesture was enough to silence the entire courtroom. The jurors glanced at each other. The prosecutor bowed his head, set his pen down, and his gaze was contemplative. In that moment, the courtroom no longer held boundaries between defendant and witness, between guilt and forgiveness, but simply two people facing each other, one who had learned the cost of pride and one who had chosen to redefine justice through compassion. The white light still shone down, reflecting on two opposing faces, but in the silence, something felt washed clean, even if the scar would remain. Isaiah looked at Mercer with a strangely calm expression. In that heavy room, his gaze held no hatred, no sense of triumph, only the understanding of a man who had once stood on the bench and now sat across from it. He looked at him long enough that Mercer had to lower his head, his eyes turning away. Under the white light, Isaiah leaned slightly, hands clasped before his chest. He said nothing, needing no words, because sometimes silence is stronger than any sentence. That silence crushed Mercer because he understood that the old man in front of him was forgiving him but could not save him from the sentence of his own conscience. The court clerk's pen scratched steadily, slowly blending with the heavy breaths of the hundreds in the gallery. No one spoke. No one moved. In that moment, everything seemed to slow, and Isaiah's eyes became the only still point in a world full of noise and judgment. The judge sat high above his hands, clasped eyes looking down at the seats below. The entire courtroom turned toward him, awaiting his ruling. The judge, once a student of Isaiah's at Harvard, looked down and spoke, his voice deep and clear. When power forgets compassion, the law must speak. The words sliced through the thick air, making everyone flinch slightly. Each syllable fell, echoed in the room, rippling like waves. The law, he continued, was not created to protect the strong, but to remind the strong they too must pause. Today, this court is not only judging the actions of one man, but also the silence that allowed wrongdoing to go unchecked for too long. Mercer looked up, his eyes, red light casting shadows on his hollow cheeks. He was no longer the defiant officer who had shouted in the rain, but a bare man standing before justice. His eyes met Isaiah's again, and in that instant, they understood each other more deeply than words could express. Isaiah gave a small nod, then turned his gaze away, his eyes now fixed on the American flag behind the bench. In those eyes was a flicker of belief that even when people fall, justice will find its way home. Outside, the midday sunlight streamed through the glass windows, casting thin but steady rays across the polished wooden floor. A few people in the courtroom wiped their tears. Others held hands, feeling as though they had just witnessed a piece of America's soul being cleansed. The judge lifted his gavel, his voice firm. Court is adjourned. The sound of 3 strikes echoed, resonating like a reminder to all generations. Mercer remained seated, his trembling hand resting on his knee, feeling as if the weight of the entire world had just been placed on his shoulders. Isaiah rose slowly, leaving his seat, his posture still upright, his shadow stretching long across the white tile floor. In that moment, it seemed there were no winners or losers, only 2 people learning to face what is right and a system of justice gradually reclaiming its true voice. The United States Capitol Chamber glowed under bright lights, rows of seats forming a semicircle around the podium. Above, the national seal shimmered in the light, reflecting off the marble ceiling. This was no ordinary session. Today's hearing was broadcast live nationwide, drawing millions of viewers. Hundreds of reporters filled the press section, while up on the balcony, lawmakers sat in silence. No one spoke to one another, all eyes fixed on the silver-haired man slowly approaching the podium, Supreme Court Justice Isaiah Cole. His shoes tapped lightly on the wooden steps, echoing through the quiet room. When Isaiah reached the center, he paused, took a deep breath, and then looked around the chamber. In the warm, golden light, every line on his face was visible, but his eyes remained clear, resolute, and calm. He spoke, his deep voice steady and clear. The law is not wrong, but those who enforce it must bow before human dignity. Each word he delivered seemed to fall directly into the hearts of those listening. In the front row, a young congressman looked up, his eyes glassy, because that sentence wasn't just for the abusers of power, but for all who had once stayed silent in the face of injustice. Isaiah paused, his gaze sweeping across the room before continuing. A society is only truly strong when those in power reflect on themselves. Power is not created to satisfy the ego, but to protect the value of human life. When those who enforce the law forget that purpose, the law becomes a weapon that harms the very people it was meant to protect. The room seemed to go still. No pens tapping, no one shifting in their seat. People looked at him and understood that standing before them was a symbol of conscience, not a speech written in advance. At the back of the chamber, a large screen showed images of victims who had suffered injustice at the hands of power. Their faces, their eyes, and Isaiah's voice blended together, forming a somber yet powerful sound. He continued, his voice softer now, but each word etched itself into the air. We could write 1,000 more laws, but if the human heart does not learn to listen, justice will remain nothing more than ink on a page. Real reform begins with humility. When he finished, the room fell into absolute silence. No one stood immediately, no applause followed, only stillness spreading like a prayer. Then, slowly, one by one, members of Congress began to rise, not out of protocol, but out of respect. Row by row, they stood, eyes fixed on the man standing tall at the wooden podium, the light surrounding him like a gentle halo. Isaiah bowed his head in thanks, his eyes shimmering, but his smile light, as if he had finally found the true meaning of his journey. Outside the Capitol building, citizens gathered to watch the hearing on a giant screen, all standing at once. In the crowd, a small boy held a sign with messy handwriting that read, "Respect before power." A light breeze passed through, and the American flag fluttered in the sunlight. In that place, in that brief moment, the entire nation seemed to pause, remembering that justice is not a symbol, but the breath of human dignity, and only when people bow before that truth can they truly stand tall in freedom. Amid the stillness of the chamber, the soft scrape of a chair echoed. From the second row, a silver-haired senator stood up, tall and slender, his eyes clear and bright. He stepped into the aisle, looking toward Isaiah S., still standing at the podium. His voice was deep, slightly hoarse, but strong enough to fill the room. "You reminded me why I once believed in justice." That simple sentence brought the chamber to a standstill. People turned to look at him, then back at Isaiah. Something stirred within them, a feeling of purpose of faith that had long been dormant beneath the compromises and calculations of power. Isaiah didn't speak. He simply nodded with a faint smile at the corner of his mouth. His eyes held compassion as if he understood that the man was not only speaking to him but also to himself. That senator had once played a key role in a judicial committee many years ago. He was known for his firmness, but also for choosing silence in the face of injustices he couldn't bring himself to confront. His words today, plain yet powerful, were a confession from someone who had lost faith in justice and now found it awakened by Isaiah. A quiet round of applause began in the corner of the room, then slowly spread steady and sincere. It was not the loud clapping of politics, but the sound of shared understanding. In that moment, the cold walls of the Capitol seemed to warm as people rediscovered something they thought was lost belief. Isaiah stepped down from the podium, the light still following him, casting a glow on his aging but steady frame. As he passed the senator, he placed a gentle hand on his shoulder, his eyes deep and kind. Justice was never lost. Isaiah said softly, it was only waiting for people to remember how to see it. The man lowered his head slightly, his lips trembling, then nodded. That exchange was never recorded in the transcript of the hearing, but everyone present knew it was the most genuine human moment Congress had witnessed in years. That afternoon, as the last sunlight fell across the stone steps of the building, a group of congressional staffers quietly paused by the grand eastern door. They looked at the newly mounted bronze plaque on the east wall, the space reserved for words that had changed the legislative history of the nation. The inscription was etched deep glowing under the sun. You reminded me why I once believed in justice. Below it, in smaller type, national hearing words of Senator David Holloway, 2025. People stopped to read, a few tourists took photos, but for those who understood its true meaning, it wasn't a slogan. It was a reminder for generations to come that justice doesn't need to be shouted, it only needs to be believed in. And whenever people forget why they began, they can return here, read that line, and remember that once a silver-haired man taught an entire nation how to believe in the light again. On sentencing day, the sky over Washington was overcast gray clouds gathering behind the federal courthouse, as if warning of an approaching storm. Inside, the courtroom was packed. The gallery was so silent that the flipping of pages by the court clerk could be heard clearly. Mercer sat in the front row, both hands clenched on his knees, his eyes sunken, his face pale. The white light from the ceiling isolated him from the rest of the world. Everyone waited for the final verdict, the moment that would close one of the most shocking cases in America that year. In the upper row, Isaiah Cole sat upright, calm. He wasn't there to witness punishment, but to see justice operate the way it should. The judge stepped up to the bench, placed a thick file in front of him, and spoke slowly, heavily. Before he could continue, Mercer stood, his voice hoarse. I deserve to be punished. The words pulled the entire room into stillness. No sound followed, only the soft sigh of an old reporter in the back row. Mercer looked straight ahead, his eyes no longer angry, no longer afraid. He continued, voice trembling, I hurt a man, and at the same time I hurt the profession I once took pride in. I don't expect forgiveness. I only hope today's sentence reminds me of what I once forgot. The words, simple yet sincere, made a few in the room lower their heads. Turner, sitting in the witness box, nodded gently, as if in silent agreement. The judge gave a slight nod, his eyes resting on the file for a moment before reading the verdict. After reviewing all evidence, the court finds the defendant, Dean Mercer, guilty of abuse of power in the line of duty and of racially motivated misconduct resulting in serious harm. The defendant is sentenced to 3 years in prison and is permanently barred from serving in law enforcement. The voice was steady, echoing through the courtroom, each word falling like a final period on everything that had come before. Mercer closed his eyes, his lips trembling slightly, then nodded. No outburst, no drama, only a man finally accepting to face his own wrongdoing. Isaiah sat quietly, his eyes resting on the front row where Mercer now bowed his head. It wasn't the look of a victor, but of someone who understood that justice isn't about revenge, it's about healing. When the judge struck the gavel 3 times, the sound echoed like the final heartbeat of a closing chapter. Outside the courthouse, the crowd stood still, no cheering, no shouting. They only looked at one another, their eyes holding something close to hope. Turner stepped closer to Isaiah and said softly, "Maybe today justice was heard." Isaiah replied with a tired but kind smile, then turned to look out the window. Rain had begun to fall, tiny drops on the glass glinting like light. A chapter closed not with thunder, but with the stillness of a heart finally awakened. The room remained suspended in silence after the final strike of the gavel. White light from the ceiling spilled onto the tiled floor like a silver ribbon. Mercer sat still, eyes fixed on his trembling hands. He heard the sound of pages turning chairs, shifting cameras, clicking all distant as if from another world. Across the room, Isaiah remained seated, his expression calm. When the judge signaled the end of the session, all eyes turned toward him. Isaiah stood his dark suit, shifting slightly with his movement, and walked slowly toward Mercer. No one dared breathe. The officer who once shouted in the rain now looked up, his gaze empty. Isaiah stopped in front of him and spoke, his voice low but steady, not heavy yet clear enough for all to hear. A sentence cannot restore trust, but it can begin it. The words cracked open the room. Each syllable fell slow, warm, and resonant like the season's first raindrops falling on parched earth. Mercer raised his head, his eyes, red lips parted to speak, but no sound came. Isaiah looked at him for a long time, his gaze no longer burdened by sorrow, but filled with an unfamiliar peace, as though he had finally laid down a weight carried for many months. In that moment, silence was no longer a wall but a form of understanding, the kind only those who had crossed the boundaries of pain could grasp. And for a brief instant, the line between victim and offender seemed to blur, leaving only 2 people facing each other, each holding a part of justice, one part to forgive, one part to relearn how to be human. The elderly judge bowed his head, his eyes catching the soft light. The rows of prosecutors and jurors remained utterly still. Then, as if by instinct, Turner was the first to rise. He placed a hand over his chest, his gaze fixed on Isaiah, and bowed deeply. Another person stood, then a third, and soon the entire room. Everyone bowed unprompted. Camera lenses lowered, journalists forgot to shoot standing still in reverent silence. The weight of the moment was hard to describe, as if they were bowing not to a man but to a value they had once lost trust. Isaiah nodded gently, a faint smile brushing across his face. He turned, walking slowly toward the door, his shoulders slightly stooped but his posture still upright. When the courthouse doors closed behind him, murmurs began to rise, but they carried no anger or curiosity, only the sighs of understanding. Outside, it was raining again, droplets falling on cold stone steps, but the light from the high windows still pierced through, shimmering across the floor like shards of glass. A young woman seated in the back whispered, her voice trembling. "That's the first time I saw justice with a human face." Turner turned to her, his eyes still wet, and smiled. In the room that had just closed a chapter of history, faith once thought lost was beginning to sprout again, quietly and steadily like light after the rain. The morning in Brookhaven was covered in a pale gray hue, with weak sunlight filtering through the window, reflecting off the long table in the center of the meeting room. The badges were lined up neatly, their cold metallic shine casting scattered reflections on the ceiling like disjointed drops of light. A room usually bustling with morning chatter was now completely silent, filled only with the soft sound of footsteps on the floor and the heavy breathing of people who once believed they stood for justice. On the wall, the motto, "Serve and Protect," seemed faded beneath a thin layer of dust. Turner stepped up first, the badge in his hand, glinting with a pale gold light. He stared at it for a long time, as if searching the metal surface for a reflection of who he had once been. Then he placed it on the table, the soft clink of metal against wood ringing out like a church bell. "I don't want it to make me forget who I am," he said, voice tight in his throat throat. The others followed one by one without saying a word. With each badge placed down, the light on the table dimmed a little more. Mercer wasn't in the room, but his name still lingered in the air like a shadow not yet dissolved. Turner looked at the row of still badges, his eyes red. Within him was a sense of regret, but also a sense of peace. He understood that the badge had once been a symbol of ideals, but it was also a mirror reflecting the mistakes they now had to bear. By setting it down, he wasn't abandoning his profession, but reclaiming its soul. Outside, the midday light grew stronger, streaming through the windows, casting streaks of brightness between the shadows in the room. The door opened, and Isaiah Cole stepped in, his pace slow but steady. Everyone in the room immediately stood up, not from protocol, but instinct. He walked past the table, his eyes settling on the row of dimly shining badges. His face no longer held the sternness of a judge, but the quiet composure of someone witnessing a moment of transformation. He spoke softly, his voice steady and warm. Sometimes losing what we think matters most helps us find what truly does. The room fell even more still, the words drifting through like a gentle breeze, touching something in each heart. Turner looked up, his eyes meeting Isaiah's. The two exchanged a small nod. It wasn't a greeting, but a shared recognition between two people who had stood on opposite sides of the same truth. Isaiah stepped closer to the table, gazing down at the gleaming badges. He reached out lightly, touching one, feeling the chill of the metal. The reflected light touched his face, revealing a faint smile like a sliver of sunlight on water. "Justice doesn't live in this badge," he said. "It lives in the choices you make when no one is watching." The people in the room bowed their heads, not in shame, but because they understood that justice is not something handed out, it is something to be upheld. As Isaiah left the station, sunlight spilled across the stone steps, illuminating each of his footsteps. Turner watched him go, feeling as though a new chapter had just begun. On the table, the badges still lay in place, faintly glowing, but enough to reflect the faces of those standing around. In that fragile light, each person saw themselves again, remembered why they once chose to wear it, and understood why today they had the courage to set it down. The room fell into silence. The wind outside drifted through the slightly open window, gently stirring the thin curtain so that the light shimmered as if it were breathing alongside them. Everyone stood around the table, eyes fixed on the row of neatly placed badges, each one reflecting their faces like tiny mirrors. No one spoke, because any word at that moment would have shattered the fragile atmosphere stretched tight between regret and awakening. Turner took a deep breath, the heaviness in his chest beginning to lift. He looked around at the colleagues who had once worn the same blue uniform, once laughed and spoke of bravery, now standing in silence with their heads bowed, eyes heavy. Perhaps they were thinking of all the times they rushed to judge, of the faces they once failed to see through to the fear behind the eyes. Isaiah still stood by the door, his hand resting gently on the wooden frame, feeling the breeze drift across his palm. He said nothing more, because sometimes silence is its own lesson. In the room, filled with the golden light of afternoon, the sight of dozens of badges lying still took on a strange kind of beauty, both sorrowful and serene. They had once symbolized power, pride, but now in the gentle sunlight of day's end they carried a different meaning, a reminder power can never rise above compassion. Everyone felt it, though no one dared speak it aloud. They simply stood quiet, as if attending an invisible farewell ceremony, each one silently letting go of a piece of their own pride. A stronger gust swept through, lifting the curtain and casting a beam of light directly onto the table. The badges suddenly shone brightly, the golden glare so intense that everyone had to squint. It wasn't the brilliance of fire, but the glow of a slow-burning candle, warm and stern. Turner looked up, filled with emotion at the sight. He knew this image would stay with him for life, not as a memory of guilt, but as a mark of awakening. Mercer might be somewhere far away, but Turner believed that man Udayu as feeling the same light, the light of a belated realization. Everyone remained standing. No one left. Time seemed to pause inside the small room. A young officer in the back spoke softly, his voice trembling but firm. "We have to do better." Turner turned around and met his gaze, clear, sincere, and filled with determination. He nodded, a small but resolute nod like a silent promise to the next generation. Isaiah smiled, his eyes gentle, then turned away, his figure gradually disappearing down the sunlit hallway. Inside, the last light of day fell across the table, making the badges glow bright in the amber hue of sunset. The light reflected on the wall, dancing like tiny streaks of flame, illuminating every scratch on the metal marks left by time and mistakes. But within that worn surface, they still emitted a pure light like a soft but stern reminder that the cost of pride is not found in the sentence, but in the very moment a person realizes they have forgotten how to be human. And on that afternoon, the light no longer belonged to the sun, but to the awakening. The sky over Washington was unusually clear that day. Sunlight streamed through the tall windows of the White House, casting a warm glow across the deep blue carpet in the Roosevelt Room. On the large wooden table, adorned with the golden national seal stacks of documents, lay neatly arranged each sheet, carrying the breath of a new chapter in history. The Cole Act, the result of months of debate, hearings, and struggle, was about to be signed into law. Advisors, senators, and representatives from the Department of Justice filled the room all silent because they understood this moment was not just an administrative procedure, but the instant a nation chose to relearn how it viewed justice. In the front row, Isaiah Cole sat quietly, his hands resting on his knees, his eyes fixed on the president's every movement as she prepared to sign. When the pen touched paper, Isaiah lowered his head slightly, his hand trembling, not from age, but from the weight of what he was witnessing. Each stroke of ink etched a belief once shattered. The silver-haired man once held at gunpoint in the street, once handcuffed in the Rarrain, now watched the law being rewritten, not by force, but by human resolve. The president looked up, smiled, then turned toward him. "Mr. Cole," she said, "this is the result of the resolve this nation needs to remember." Isaiah rose, bowed slightly, his eyes shining in the reflected light from the window. His voice, deep and steady, rang out softly. "A bullet can kill a man, but silence can kill a generation." The room fell completely silent. The president nodded, her hand resting on the signed document, her expression briefly touched by emotion. A few held back tears. Advisors who once fiercely debated the scope of the bill now looked at one another no longer as opponents, but as allies. The Cole Act mandates that all uses of police force must be recorded, reported, and independently reviewed by a civilian commission. It is not merely oversight, but a promise that every officer who draws a weapon must remember they do not hold the power of life and death, but a responsibility. Isaiah watched quietly as the document was lifted for photographs, his heart filled with emotion. This was not his victory, but one for what is right. The ceremony ended and people began to leave the room. Isaiah slowly approached the window where sunlight poured in. Outside the south lawn of the White House was a sea of green birdsong echoing like a peaceful melody. He looked down at his hands, the calluses fading with the years, then smiled. Perhaps justice has never felt stronger than it does now, he thought. Behind him, a sign reading, "Cole Act," signed into law, caught the afternoon light glimmering like a small torch passed to the next generation. In that moment, Isaiah understood that silence had once killed trust, but today words spoken with dignity had saved an entire era. After the signing ceremony, press swarmed the White House like a wave. Every newspaper, every television channel ran images of the silver-haired man standing beside the president, his hands clasped in front, his face gentle, but his eyes blazing. Across front pages, bold headlines stretched wide, "The Man Who Made Justice Bow." The phrase echoed for days, a new symbol of America after years of wounded unrest. But amid the praise, Isaiah Cole said nothing. He avoided interviews, declined televised conversations, and turned down every invitation from prestigious institutions. He returned to his small home in suburban Maryland, where an old garden and a weathered wooden chair waited. There, he sat quietly looking at the afternoon skylight spilling over his face, a soft, golden haze gently revealing the lines carved by time. He knew that title was not glory, but a reminder. The man who made justice. Bow, a beautiful phrase, but also a tragedy, because something had to be broken for people to need him to restore it. Isaiah understood justice had never been arrogant, only turned into a tool by people trying to prove their power. And through all the storms he walked, what wore him down most wasn't the lies, but the indifferent eyes that once made him believe compassion had died. Now, as light filled the garden, he looked up at the drifting clouds and smiled faintly. In that smile was the peace of someone who had faced the abyss and returned without carrying bitterness. A soft breeze moved through rustling the young leaves. In the distance, church bells rang their rhythm, steady like the breath of the evening. Isaiah closed his eyes, letting the wind carry away the noise from the world outside. He remembered his younger days, the first time he wore the robe of a judge, believing justice was a perfect scale, but now he knew it was a flame kept alive only by the heart. The man who made justice bow. He repeated in his thoughts, then exhaled gently. If justice ever bows, it's because it has learned to listen to humanity. No one heard those words, but somehow the wind seemed to carry them far, blending into the sound of leaves falling to the ground. Evening settled in, and the last light swept across the porch, casting its glow on his face. In that light, Isaiah's face appeared both weary and gentle, like a mirror reflecting all the things people had forgotten: humility, compassion, and the capacity to forgive. He looked up at the sky where a flock of birds flew westward, their wings shimmering in the fading sun. A neighbor boy ran past, shouting, "I saw you on TV. They called you a hero." Isaiah smiled, replying softly, "Heroes are the ones who change, not the ones who get named." The boy paused, then grinned shyly, nodded, and ran off. When the door closed behind him, Isaiah looked around the small garden, a sense of peace spreading through the space. On the table, the morning newspaper remained open, the headline, "The Man Who Made Justice Bow," stretched across the page, catching the dimming sunlight. He placed his hand on the paper, gently smoothed it, then let go. Outside, the sky turned pale orange, the air wrapped in what felt like a soft silk veil. Isaiah leaned back in his chair, the light enveloping him warm and gentle, like the only reward meant for a man who had walked through storms and still held on to his humanity. The morning on Lincoln Avenue was unusually clear. After many long months, the rain had finally stopped, leaving the road spotless, glistening under the sunlight as if the dirt of the past had been washed away too. Wind passed through the roadside trees, their leaves gently rustling the sound, rising softly like a melody of peace. Isaiah Cole walked slowly along the sidewalk, his frame thinner and his pace slower than before. But each step remained steady, as if every movement was a quiet tribute to the ground that had once borne witness to a defining moment. He stopped in the middle of the avenue, where a blurred streak of paint still marked the asphalt, a remnant of the day someone had drawn a false line between power and dignity. Isaiah bent down his fingertip, brushing the cold pavement, and the memory returned: the rain, the shouting, the chill of a gun barrel, and the strange calm that had come over him in that moment. Now everything had changed. There were no more sirens, no more crowds filming. Only the sound of the wind and the breath of time remained. Isaiah stood there for a long while, watching the painted streak shimmer under the sun, his heart sinking with both peace and weight. In the place where he had once knelt in humiliation, he was standing again, quietly but with pride. A soft breeze passed, spinning a few dry leaves to the ground beside his feet. Isaiah smiled, and in that smile was both exhaustion and serenity, as if he were saying goodbye to a memory that had completed its purpose. Suddenly, the light steps of a child echoed from behind. A boy, about 8 or 9, ran up, his eyes bright and curls catching the sun. He stopped, catching his breath, then called out, "I know you. Mom says you're the one who changed America." Isaiah turned his gaze gentle. He placed a hand on the boy's shoulder and smiled. "Not me. The people who listened after made the change." The boy looked up wide-eyed as if trying to understand the weight of those words. Isaiah leaned down, his voice low and warm. "Justice doesn't begin in courtrooms. It begins in each person's heart. When you stop to help someone or speak up when something's wrong, that too is justice." The boy nodded, his innocent smile spreading, then ran back to the woman waiting in the distance, glancing back to wait. Isaiah watched him go, the small figure blending into the moving crowd along the avenue, and a lightness rose in his chest. Sunlight touched his silver hair, making it glow faintly like a soft halo. He looked up at the cloudless blue sky, where the light stretched wide like a promise that even the deepest wounds can be healed. In the place that once saw trust collapse, now only silence remained, not the silence of pain, but of awakening. Isaiah walked on his shadow, stretching long across the sunlit pavement, moving with the breeze, flowed down the avenue like a part of the story the nation had rewritten, not with guns, but with grace. Isaiah smiled gently, his eyes carrying the quiet light of someone who had weathered every storm. The wind passed, carrying the scent of grass and the warmth of the sun, lifting a few silver strands from his forehead. The boy's words still echoed in his mind, making him shake his head slightly, the smile deepening as he spoke in a warm, calm voice. "No, I just reminded them that people matter more than power." The words dissolved into the breeze, yet they echoed within him like a simple melody of what is right. He knew change didn't come from a hearing or a verdict, but from small moments when someone realized another person's life was worth more than their own pride. Isaiah stood still for a moment, his gaze following the people moving down Lincoln Avenue, where sunlight touched every face, regardless of color or status. In that light, he saw what he had pursued all his life, that fairness did not live in law, but in how people chose to see one another. In the distance, the sound of car horns blended with the wind, and footsteps forming the everyday music of a city coming back to life. Isaiah lowered himself slightly, touching the pavement where he had once knelt. Now, the old paint had faded, but in his heart the memory remained vivid, as if it had happened only yesterday. "Everything has a price," he whispered, "and the price of arrogance sometimes is an entire soul." He rose, taking a deep breath as if to hold on to the scent of freedom, the peace he had spent a lifetime fighting to reclaim. Above him, the white clouds drifted slowly, reflected in his eyes that were gentle yet deep, as if holding all the seasons of rain that had passed. A young woman pulled her car to the side of the road, saw him, and gave a respectful nod. He returned it with a soft smile, then continued walking slow but steady. His footsteps marked the polished road, blending with the crowd in motion. Every step carried meaning, not of victory, but of resolve. Isaiah knew what he left behind wasn't fame, nor the harsh lines of law, but the memory of a man who had dared to stand upright in a storm without losing his humanity. Each step was like a heartbeat of memory, each one recalling faces, voices, and tears from those who once believed justice was out of reach until they saw him. As he reached the end of the avenue, sunlight slanted through the rows of trees, casting long streaks of light on the ground. He paused, once more turning to look back where the boy still stood beside his mother, arms raised in a wave. Isaiah raised his hand in return, the smile still on his face. Step by step, he left Lincoln Avenue behind his shadow, stretching in the sunlight, blending with the breeze drifting down the street. His pace was slow, steady, but one thing was certain. It was the walk of a man who had never bowed. Each step he took was not a departure, but a continuation. He was walking behind the arc of history, where ordinary people would go on to write the next chapters of the story. He had begun a story about trust awakening and a justice that listens to the human heart. In that radiant afternoon, Isaiah Cole walked on gently, but each step echoed like the rhythm of dignity ringing out beneath the vast sky of freedom. Inside the federal prison, sunlight streamed through the narrow steel window, landing on Mercer's calloused hands as he sat at the old wooden desk, writing line by line on a blank sheet of paper. The ink bled slowly, his handwriting firm but trembling as if each word carried a fracture in his soul. He paused, glanced at the slivers of light falling through the window, then bent back down to continue. "I used to think power was in the gun. Now I know it's in regret." As the sentence took shape, he set the pen down, staring at the wet ink, a strange mix of emptiness and peace rising within him. 3 years behind bars wasn't long in the span of a life, but it was enough to turn everything he once believed into questions. Now he no longer dreamed of chases or patrols, but of the calm gaze of the man he once pointed a gun at, a gaze without anger, only reflection that forced him to face himself. Mercer folded the letter, slipped it into an envelope, sealed it, and wrote on the front, "To the Supreme Court for Justice, Isaiah Cole." As the stamp pressed down, he felt a weight lift from his chest, as if a piece of the past had been peeled off his shoulders. He stood, handed the letter to the guard, then returned to his bed, sitting silently as he looked at the sky shift color beyond the yard. That sky, though cut by bars, was the only freedom he could still touch. He closed his eyes, letting the light slip through his lids, and told himself that even if he couldn't undo what had been done, at least he had learned something about strength, that it doesn't lie in authority, but in the ability to bow before one's own mistake. A few days later, in the office of the Supreme Court, Isaiah Cole received that envelope. The clerk placed it on his desk, her eyes briefly flickering with surprise at the sender's name. Isaiah picked it up, studying the familiar scrawl, his gaze resting there for a moment before he opened it. As he read the first line, he paused, breathing slowly. The words were plain, no excuses, no pleas, just the bare truth of a soul learning to face itself. When he reached the final sentence, his fingers touched the edge of the paper, slightly trembling. He looked out the window, where the sky was clear and white clouds drifted gently as if all chaos had passed. He spoke softly but clearly. "If he understands that justice has done its part." The clerk beside him bowed her head slightly, while Isaiah folded the letter and placed it in the wooden box where he kept the things that reminded him to believe in humanity. He did not write back because he understood that some answers don't need to be written, they only need to be understood. The afternoon light spilled through the window, hitting the letter, making the ink glow faintly. In that quiet room, justice was no longer a verdict or power, but a conversation between two souls, one who had forgiven and one learning to live again from the ashes of a mistake. Mercer's letter was delivered to the Supreme Court, and after reading it, Isaiah requested that it be archived rather than answered. He wanted it preserved as a silent witness for anyone who might later need to understand that justice is not a grand building, but the journey of human growth. Months later, when the National Museum of Justice hosted an exhibit titled "The Footsteps of Justice," the letter was displayed in a plain glass frame at the center of the gallery. A small plaque beneath it identified the sender and its origin, while above a line was delicately engraved, "The day the law learned compassion." The room remained lit at all hours, white light shining onto the glass, reflecting each word Mercer had written as if they had just been penned. Visitors stood a long time in front of the letter. Many read it once, then quietly came back to read it again. Among thousands of artifacts, old photographs, verdicts, oaths, scraps from police uniforms, it was this brief letter that held them the longest. Perhaps in those shaky lines, people saw themselves, the times they were wrong, the times they stayed silent, the times they assumed the right to judge others. A group of law students from Texas stood in silence, and their guide softly said, "You're looking at justice not through theory, but through repentance." The words came like a whisper, yet were enough to make the young ones lower their eyes as if they had just brushed against something sacred. Isaiah visited the exhibit on a late afternoon. He moved slowly through the displays, his gaze stopping at each photo, each record. When he reached the central area, he paused before Mercer's letter. The light reflected off his thin glasses, making it hard to tell whether his eyes held sorrow or pride. Isaiah read reread each line, his lips moving slightly as if reading aloud in time with memory. When he reached the end, his eyes rested on the unsteady signature, Dean Mercer. A silence settled, and he gave a small nod as if speaking to a soul that had learned to bow before the truth. He told the museum curator, "Keep it always, because this is the most beautiful evidence that the law is not without feeling, only that people sometimes forget how to listen to it." The curator nodded, his eyes lit with emotion. In the dimming glow of sunset filtering through the windows, the letter appeared to shine with its own light. The engraved words, "The day the law learned compassion," seemed to soften and hue warmer, as if smiling. In the hallway, visitors continued to enter, the sound of shoes on the wooden floor forming a steady rhythm. A small girl held her mother's hand, looked up at the glass case, and asked, "Mom, what is justice?" The mother smiled, leaned down, and quietly replied, "It's when you choose to care before you choose to judge." The answer was simple, but so true that those nearby turned slightly silent. When the museum closed, the lights in the room remained on, illuminating the small letter in the glass case. Outside, the sky turned violet, and the evening light filtered through the window, blending with the room's glow to create a pale, golden hue, gentle, like the breath of a dream. The letter remained there between the world of law and the human heart, like a timeless reminder that the law may make people bow their heads, but only compassion teaches them how to stand tall. On the morning of the inauguration, a thin layer of clouds covered the city sky, and the breeze carried the moisture of the previous night's rain. In the middle of the central square, the bronze statue of Isaiah Cole stood tall, over 10 feet high, depicting him standing in the rain, arms lowered, eyes firmly fixed forward. The first light of day reflected on the bronze surface, casting bright golden streaks, making the statue appear alive beneath the gray clouds. People gathered around, not noisy, not chaotic, but silently still, their gazes united in solemnity. A group of children stepped forward, holding small bouquets, and placed them at the statue's base. The petals, damp from the rain, drooped, yet their colors were strangely vivid, as if their innocence was making up for the wounds history had once left behind. The adults stood behind them, some veterans, some teachers, workers, police officers, each bowing their heads. They bowed, not before a man, but before a meaning. The meaning that justice does not rest on a high pedestal, but in the hearts of those brave enough to keep it alive. The wind passed through, rustling the leaves and softly brushing the flowers against one another. At the front, a brown-skinned boy stood still, eyes lifted to the statue, lips quietly mouthing the words etched into the base, "Justice lives when humanity breathes." The inscription ran deep, the bronze strokes catching light as if exhaling with the breath of a human spirit. A simple sentence, yet it carried the spirit Isaiah had lived his entire life to prove. A light breeze drifted by, and a few drops of water fell from the statue, merging with the petals below, sounding like a whisper. An elderly woman wiped away tears. She had witnessed the incident all those years ago, her hair now white, but the memory was still vivid. She turned to the person beside her and quietly said, "He didn't just make the law stronger, he made people better." The young man next to her nodded, his gaze distant, fixed on the place where light reflected off the statue like a guiding torch. Around the square, hundreds of people remained, none leaving early, each carrying their own feeling, but all sharing one belief that they were living in an era where justice had taken form not through gavels, but through the eyes of a man who dared to stand upright in the storm. In the afternoon light, rain returned. The light dimmed, and droplets fell on the statue, making the bronze glow with a reddish hue. Children still played around the square, their laughter ringing through the rain, pure as a promise to the future. At the base of the statue, the flower bouquets absorbed the rain, their scent blending with the smell of wet air, spreading throughout the space in a fragrance both mournful and beautiful. On the bronze pedestal, the words, "Justice lives when humanity breathes," reflected the newly lit street lamps, shimmering as if glowing from within. There, justice was no longer distant. It had become part of the city's breath, of its people, and of the generations growing up in the light Isaiah Cole had left behind. Evening settled in the sky, bathed in a pale amber hue, and the soft light cast onto the bronze statue made Isaiah's resolute expression appear almost lifelike. The crowd thinned, leaving only a few people lingering, watching the bronze torch glow under the golden lights of the square. The gentle sound of rain fell on the tiled roofs, blending with the city's gradually slowing rhythm. In the distance, Turner approached, his posture quiet, his eyes filled with an emotion he tried to hide. His dark coat was damp with evening mist as he walked slowly toward the statue, where Isaiah stood silently beside it, watching the last visitors leave the square. When Turner stopped, they stood side by side without speaking, listening only to the steady rain on the pavement. After a while, Turner placed a hand on Isaiah's shoulder, a light but respectful gesture, his voice rough with emotion. "You did what the entire system forgot." Isaiah turned his gaze, softening deep and clear as if the weight on his shoulders had lifted. He didn't reply, just offered a quiet smile, both grateful and at peace. In the dim light, his face seemed to glow, and Turner realized he didn't need words to respond, because sometimes silence is the language of those who truly understand justice. They stood there a long time. Turner looked up at the statue, the bronze face of Isaiah glowing warmly, then looked at the real man beside him. He spoke again, his voice soft as if afraid the wind might carry it away. "Years ago, I thought justice meant enforcing orders, but today I understand it means listening to people." Isaiah listened, his eyes reflecting quiet joy. He placed a hand on Turner's shoulder, thin but steady, as both a recognition and a thank you. A breeze passed through, carrying in the damp scent of earth and the fragrance of flowers at the statue's base, and the two men looked into the distance where the streetlights were starting to glow. A group of students passed by holding small flags, pausing cheerfully to take pictures at the monument. One boy turned to Isaiah and asked, "Are you the man in the statue?" Turner chuckled, but Isaiah only nodded gently. The boy looked up the statue, his innocent eyes full of admiration, then turned to his friend and whispered, "He's the man who gave justice a heart." The simple remark caught both men by surprise. Turner smiled, and Isaiah looked after the boy, his eyes filled with a deep faith that the new generation had understood what the one before had taken a lifetime to realize. Dusk settled in the last drops of rain falling on their shoulders, dissolving into mist. Turner reached into his pocket, pulled out the old badge, the only thing he kept after resigning, and placed it at the foot of the statue. "I don't deserve to wear it," he said, "but I'll try to live like the man it should belong to." Isaiah looked at him, his eyes warm like the last light of day, then nodded gently. He lifted his gaze to the bronze statue before them, where the lights shimmered in reflection, and smiled the smile of someone who had seen justice bow and people rise. In the wind, Turner felt something quiet yet sacred. Isaiah said nothing, but he was telling the world that compassion is the only thing that gives law a soul. In the midst of the evening breeze, the two men stood side by side in a city that had learned to breathe again through dignity. On an autumn morning, golden sunlight stretched across the Harvard University campus. Rows of maple trees, turning a brilliant red, their leaves drifting gently in the breeze, creating a scene both solemn and tender. In the main hall of the law school, hundreds of students had arrived early, the air perfectly still, broken only by the rustle of notebooks and the soft scratch of pens. Today was Isaiah Cole's final lecture before officially retiring after more than 40 years of teaching and contributing to the justice system. On the lectern, he entered to a soft murmur, his frame thin but still carrying the gravity of a judge who had once rewritten a nation's fate. He set down his briefcase, removed his glasses, and looked around the classroom, his eyes glowing with a warm light tinged with the weariness of someone preparing to part with what he loved most. His voice rang out calm and steady. each word falling clearly. If you're studying just to win, then from the beginning you've already lost. The hall fell silent. Isaiah paused, letting the quiet settle, then continued. The law is not a game, and justice is not a victory. It is the responsibility of those who dare to step into darkness and carry light to others. If you carry ambition, you will find power. But if you carry compassion, you will find justice. In the front row, a female student quietly wrote down every word, her eyes filled with emotion. Isaiah smiled when he saw this, his gaze softening, knowing the seeds of belief were still being planted. A male student stood up, his voice trembling slightly but filled with respect. "Sir, if you were to meet Mercer again, what would you do?" The question seemed to still the room. All eyes turned to Isaiah. He tilted his head slightly, a faint smile at the corner of his lips. He answered slowly, his voice quiet, but carrying to every corner of the hall. "I would shake his hand." The room stirred, and a few looked up in surprise. Isaiah looked at them, his eyes deep as if seeing through their unspoken question. "I would shake his hand," he continued, "because what he did was wrong, but what he learned from it was right. Forgiveness is not erasing a mistake, but allowing someone the chance to make it right." His words echoed through the hall, leaving everyone silent. A female student's eyes welled with tears. She looked toward the lectern and softly asked, "Sir, then what is justice?" Isaiah looked at her, his eyes filled with kindness and experience. "Justice," he said, "is when a person stops in time before hurting someone else. It is when you understand that every verdict is delivered not just to the guilty, but also to the conscience of the one holding the gavel." He paused, drew a deep breath, then smiled. "And when you know how to bow before another's dignity, you have stood tall in the eyes of justice." Applause rang out, first scattered, then swelling into a wave. Isaiah bowed his head slightly in thanks, the golden light from the window casting a glow over his silver hair, making it shine like a halo. He stepped down from the lectern, paused at the door, and turned to look at the classroom one last time. In that moment, he saw radiant young faces, saw the belief in their eyes, and he understood that his true legacy was not in verdicts or laws, but in how these people would carry justice forward. As he stepped outside, the autumn wind swept through the corridor, carrying the sound of fallen maple leaves, soft as a farewell from time itself. Isaiah smiled, walking into the golden light of the afternoon, his figure growing smaller, but his voice remained echoing in the hearts of those who had heard him like an unshakable vow to dignity, fairness, and humanity. Isaiah paused at the question, his eyes turned toward the hall, silent and still. He looked at the young faces, at eyes waiting not just for an answer to today's lesson, but for the faith behind everything they were learning for a lifetime. The golden light from the window spilled across the lectern, tracing a warm outline along his shoulders. He closed his eyes for a moment, as if listening to an echo from the past, then opened to them, his voice deep and firm. "I would shake his hand, because the one who repents has already conquered himself." The words were not loud, but they rang like a bell in the stillness. The students in the front rows looked at one another. Some lowered their eyes, others sat motionless, as if they had just heard something beyond what any book of law could teach. Isaiah scanned the hall, his gaze softening, a faint smile brushing the corner of his lips. "Justice was not made to punish," he continued, "but to teach people that true fairness begins with compassion. When someone dares to face their own wrongdoing, they rise above their past. And when we are generous enough to see that we keep justice alive with a soul." Each word fell slowly, not as doctrine, but like a personal truth being shared. The wind outside the window stirred gently, rustling the maple trees, the sound of leaves brushing together like the slow ticking of time. Isaiah continued, his voice low and warm. "I have seen people I thought would never change. But then, in the moment they realized the pain they had caused others, a light rose in them again. The power of the law does not lie in the sentence, but in the chance for someone to begin again. He lifted his gaze, the light reflecting in his eyes like a fire of belief that had never gone out. A female student stood up, eyes glistening, both hands gripping her notebook. She said nothing, but her slow nod spoke like a wordless thank you. Then, one by one, others in the hall began to stand as well, chairs creaking softly, the sound rising like a quiet reply. No one clapped, no one cheered. They simply bowed their heads. That silence was not empty, but reverent, offered to a man who had taught them that compassion is the hardest part of protecting justice. Isaiah looked down, his heart trembling slightly, not with pride, but with emotion. He placed a hand over his chest and bowed in return. In the warm light, he and those students shared a rare moment where knowledge and humanity became one. As the room remained still, the bells from Harvard's old chapel rang out, each chime long and steady, spreading across the campus. Isaiah looked up, his gaze turning toward the window where the sky was tilting into shades of blue and amber. He spoke softly, as if to himself. Justice never grows old as long as people still know how to bow to one another. The words were carried away by the wind, blending with the bells, but everyone present that day remembered them. Years later, they would still recount that moment as a symbol, the day a class stood in silence, not to honor power, but to bow before a soul that had shown them the greatest victory of all, the ability to repent and to forgive. The morning in Washington was clearer than usual. The early sunlight spilling across the white stone steps of the Supreme Court, making the building's facade glow like it had been gilded. The cherry trees lining the walkway swayed gently in the breeze, petals drifting sparsely, creating a strangely peaceful scene. Isaiah Cole descended the steps slowly, holding in his hand the old wooden gavel he had kept through the years, a witness to thousands of trials, thousands of rulings, and countless moments when he had to face his own conscience. His face was calm, his eyes warm and deep, reflecting the clear sky above. Reporters were already waiting, microphones, raised cameras aimed directly at him, but the atmosphere fell quiet, as if everyone understood they were witnessing the final moment of a symbol. A young female reporter stepped forward, her voice trembling slightly. "Sir, after everything you've been through, do you still believe justice exists?" Isaiah paused. The light glinting off his silver hair made him look as though surrounded by a halo. He smiled, a kind and seasoned smile, then answered slowly, his voice soft, clear, resonating through the still air. "Justice lives in the heart of those who know when to stop before they harm." The crowd fell completely silent. No one took notes. No one called out another question, because in that moment it felt as if he had spoken something that transcended language. A gentle breeze passed through, lifting a few reporters' notes into the air, letting them drift in the sunlight like fragments of memory dissolving. Isaiah moved on his shoes, tapping softly on the stone floor, footsteps blending with the wind like the quiet rhythm of passing time. He stopped at the final step, lowered his gaze to the gavel in his hand, eyes narrowing gently. All these years he had struck it to close trials, to pronounce judgment over others. But now he knew the final strike it awaited was the one that brought peace to his own heart. He raised it, studied it for a long moment, then said softly, as if speaking to an old friend, "Time to rest." A faint smile appeared on his lips, tender as a last beam of sunlight at day's end. Behind him, the crowd continued to watch, and someone whispered, "He doesn't need to say anything else." Isaiah turned back, looking at the towering building against the blue sky, the place he had given his life to, and bowed his head gently. The gesture was simple, yet deeply moving. Then he turned away, his figure growing smaller in the light, but his shadow stretching across the stone like a bridge between past and present. A few young people stood still, silently, bowing their heads, and in their eyes there was no sadness, only gratitude. As Isaiah walked through the main gate, sunlight slanted across his shoulder, casting a golden honey-colored glow on his hair. He looked up at the sky and took a deep breath, the scent of spring slipping into every breath. In the distance, church bells rang, their sound lingering, blending with the wind and the sound of his fading footsteps. The wooden gavel was still still in his hand, but now it was no longer a symbol of authority, rather a testament to a life spent preserving humanity within the law. Isaiah walked toward the park where children played under the sun. He paused, smiled, and then continued. That last light fell across his shoulder, shimmering like a blessing from time itself, that justice would live on as long as people remembered how to love one another. Isaiah walked slowly through the bright morning light of Washington. The path from the Supreme Court to the avenue shimmered under a soft golden hue, reflecting on each white stone, creating the brilliance not only of a new day but of an era that had just closed. He walked among the crowd, his tall, slender figure standing out among shirts, suits, and the steady rhythm of shoes on pavement. A few people recognized him. They paused, eyes following him, a few nods, a few quiet smiles, like greetings for someone who had left an indelible mark on history. Isaiah returned their gazes gently, then moved on his figure, blending into the flow of people as ordinary as any citizen on a peaceful morning. But within that simplicity there was something that made people stop, a feeling like they had just seen a symbol step down from a pedestal to return to the very life he had spent his whole existence protecting. On the sidewalk, sunlight lit the young trees sprouting leaves, their shadows scattered beneath his feet. Isaiah stopped beside a small cafe where young people chatted excitedly about the future, about new laws, about the justice they believed could be better than what the generation before had left behind. He smiled, a tender look in his eyes, then quietly walked away, his steps slow and steady like the heartbeat of the city. At the corner, an old newspaper vendor was arranging the morning editions, the first headline showing Isaiah's picture with the title, "The Man Who Made Justice Bow." Isaiah glanced at it, a kind smile forming at the edge of his lips. He did not stop nor look back. He knew it was not that he had made justice bow, but that he had helped the people lift their heads to see themselves again. A soft breeze passed along the avenue, carrying the scent of cherry blossoms and distant church bells. Isaiah closed his eyes, taking a deep breath. That sound, that scent, that light, they all blended into a gentle song of life. He opened his eyes, took a few more steps, and in the wind his voice rose soft, clear, as if speaking to himself and to the world. Justice never dies if people still know how to love. The words faded into the air light as breath, but echoing far like a vow left for the future. Those nearby turned, a few paused. No one said a word, only smiled quietly, as if they had just heard something very old yet entirely new. Isaiah kept walking, his figure blending into the sunlight spreading across the avenue. Each step seemed to merge with the rhythm of the city, where justice was no longer a slogan, but a breath, a quiet kindness between people. Above the sky was clear, and white clouds drifted slowly, reflecting light on every pane of glass on the Supreme Court behind him. There, the gavel had been laid to rest, the law had gained a new chapter, and Isaiah Cole, the man who had walked the entire journey, was now moving through a world he once dreamed of, where justice and compassion lived together in the heartbeat of every soul. Another breeze passed, gentle and warm, as if even time was bowing to the man who had given it meaning. As the last light settled over the city of Washington, Isaiah Cole's story closed in a silence full of gravity. From that cold, rainy afternoon on Lincoln Avenue, when a young officer's gun was pressed to his forehead, to the day he walked beneath golden sunlight with a peaceful smile, his journey was not just the story of a man, but a mirror reflecting a society torn between power and humanity. Mercer, who once believed he was the law, had knelt before the weight of his own conscience, while Isaiah, once bound in steel cuffs, made the world understand that true strength lies not in force, but in the ability to forgive and to hold on to humanity even when dishonored. From the moment a bullet nearly stole his dignity to the day justice cast its light across America, that journey made millions reflect on how they treat one another. Isaiah's story was not an indictment of the police, but a mirror for those who hold power in their hands. He did not seek revenge, nor did he try to bring Mercer down. He simply made him him face the cost of arrogance and the blindness once mistaken for strength. In every look, every word Isaiah spoke, people saw something simple yet profound. That justice does not need to be shouted. It only needs to be lived in the hearts of those who choose what is right, no matter how small the act. The nation awakened. Protests, hashtags, and speeches were not about glorifying one man, but about restoring the trust that had been lost. Turner, once silent out of fear, learned that silence is also a form of wrongdoing. Mercer, after years behind bars, came to understand that strength is not in a gun, but in the courage to admit one's fault. And Isaiah, who walked through it all, left behind a lesson no law book could ever teach: that compassion is the only thing that can save the law from becoming a tool of indifference. The bronze statue in the middle of the square, the flowers laid at its base, and the engraved words, "Justice lives." When humanity breathes are not merely symbols of a man, but an eternal reminder that justice can never exist apart from human dignity. When a little boy asked Isaiah, "Did you change America?" he smiled and replied, "I only reminded them that people matter more than power." That answer was the essence of an entire life proof that in every storm the world may face, compassion remains a light that never goes out. And then, as Isaiah walked into the sunlight, his tall, slender figure blending into the crowd, a breeze swept through, carrying his final words: "Justice never dies as long as people still know how to love one another." It was not just a farewell, but a message for all who still believe in what is right. The lesson his story left behind wasn't in the tears or the verdicts, but in the awakening of the heart. Taught that the true strength of a person is not in the ability to make others bow, but in knowing when to stop before causing harm. When a society learns to bow before human dignity, when people learn to hear the voice of compassion, then justice no longer needs to be sought because it is always lived in every breath we take.